All right, well, I'll go ahead and get started. That way we can go ahead and get finished. My name is Dan Holden. I'm the director of ACERT, which is Arbor Network's security research organization. I've been at Arbor now for a little over a year. Prior to that, 15 years in the IPS industry, but we can talk about that over drinks. Want to talk a bit about modern threat motives. And it just so happens because I work at a company that is heavily involved in DDoS mitigation, I'm going to use DDoS along the way as some of these examples, although not all the time. But the motives here, which you can see they butchered on the schedule there, is actually the more important part of this talk. And I'll end this talk with cyber warfare so that we're all sufficiently worked up and ready for those drinks that we deserve. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about just a little bit of history. How did we get to where we are? So what does this new threat landscape look like? You could call it advanced, you can call it modern, whatever works for you. But just want to give kind of a couple baselines here, right? Most of these you know, but I just want to make a couple of comments. More defenses is pretty important. I know we all enjoy making fun of AV. I find firewalls to be interesting. We had 65,000 perfectly usable ports. We brought that down to roughly 3, and now they tell you you need new firewalls to understand all the applications that you're funneling through those 3 ports. Whatever does it for you. So the point is, attackers know that you have defenses, right? They, as people have been saying all day long, right? That's what compliance has brought. The attackers know they're there. Obviously, we're all still getting owned, so there's more work to do. I think probably the most important part for me, my entire life being the InfoSec industry, is the geopolitical aspect. I've followed politics also for most of my life, and I find the fact that it used to be I would pull up my favorite websites, the dark readings, e-weeks, etc. And that's how I would find out what's going on in our industry. Now I just read the BBC. That's where I find that anything that's happening in the world is now reflected in the threat landscape. And I think if you haven't come to that conclusion yet, you're being a little naive. But there will be plenty of things during this conversation where you'll likely disagree with me on things, so that could be the first one. The network has certainly changed. We obviously have mobile, which we've heard about today. We've got cloud, we've got VPNs, Wi-Fi. The internet essentially is now the extension of your network. And so the network itself has fundamentally changed. Obviously, BYOD, as we mentioned, everything, of course, is applications and content. And then we do have legacy infrastructure, and you all know this. Actually, I heard a talk from H.D. Moore late last year where he attempted to scan the majority of the internet. And it wasn't surprising to me how many NT4 machines he stumbled across. It was surprising to me how many NT35 machines he stumbled across. They are still out there. The number, thankfully, wasn't large, but they exist. All right, so how? And so that's the what's changed, or what stayed the same in some cases. I think these we all know about, right? Vulnerabilities have been with us for a very long time. I'm going to talk, we'll have talks about those tomorrow. Botnets, malware, et cetera, right? The threats themselves haven't changed so dramatically. The maturity, the commodity aspect of these threats has changed, right? So I think what has changed, especially over the last 3 years, I would say, in what is this modern or advanced landscape we are in, is the motivation. We are very used to cybercrime. That has been around now, since mid-2000s at least. But hacktivism is fairly new compared to other things. APT fairly new in terms of at least, let me say this. Not that any of these things are new, whether it's APT or cyber warfare or even hacktivism. What is new is the average citizen's visibility into these things, all right? So if you've been in the industry for a long time, you've seen a lot of things. You always have, war stories, but my point here is the average citizen that is pulling up BBC now hears about these terms. And that change has really happened over the last 3 years, all right? So yes, these things have been around, but I'd say we talk about them a lot more now, all right? So I want to start with cybercrime. This one actually is still a bit fun. It's been around for quite some time, but this is really the aspect of the threat landscape that is quite commoditized. It's very cheap and very easy to get into it, and the return on this type of business is changing all the time. So what I want to do is kind of give you a walkthrough. If you wanted to build your own botnet, in other words, if you wanted to quit your job tomorrow and become a cyber criminal, here's kind of an example by example way to do it. First thing I want to do is actually talk about DDoS for just a moment. You can see this example here is called a host booter. This is actually a very good example of what the majority of DDoS every day on the internet looks like. I know you hear lots of headlines saying DDoS is getting bigger and badder and the attacks are gigantic and awful. It's mainly just because, right, any security vendor in the space, their view into what's bad on the internet is based on their customers. Obviously, if your business is defending enterprise customers that are always getting DDoSed, you're probably going to have an insight into the DDoS landscape that says things are really bad and really big. If you look at this from an ISP standpoint, the majority of the attacks every day are small. Small being, most of them are 1 to 2 gigs, all right? They're not these massive things. Most of your DDoS activity is kids on Xbox, just like we were back in the 90s on IRC. Somebody says something you don't like, or they're beating you at Call of Duty. It's pretty easy to get DDoS, all right? Same thing with small websites. This kind of thing happens all the time, all right? So this is the kind of tool that's used for this. Now you'll notice one of the tabs here says bot builder, all right? So what you're going to do is you're going to take some piece of malware such as this, and you can see there's only one bot loaded in this. They're generally small. It doesn't take much to knock somebody off of Xbox, not in this country anyway. So you click on this bot builder tab, and this is another tool, but I'm just using this as an example. And you can see here pretty easy, right? You put in your version number, what you want it to be called, the port you want to go after, and then there's all these checkboxes here: anti-sandbox, anti-VMware, anti-Joebox. So these are meant to, all right, do you want to make this piece of malware detectable, evadable, et cetera, right? So again, going back to the attackers are well aware that you have defenses in place. Sometimes they will attempt to evade you. Sometimes they will not, because if you have a sandbox set up or you have some kind of proxy set up and they know that you're going to be looking at this, dissecting it, they just won't check that stuff. And it might get by easier if it's not trying to evade you. Just depends, and that is their choice. All right, going back to the previous example, that is a DDoS tool, but it actually has a Firefox password stealer as well. All right, so this is something that has fundamentally changed, especially over the last several years. DDoS has not, it's changed from being what I think most people think of as a networking problem, right? You think of DDoS, and unfortunately people still think of Mafia Boy and SynFlood, and it's way past that. But in the case of a lot of the DDoS-related malware, there are new functionality, and that's some of what I'm going to highlight to you today. In this case, steals Firefox passwords, right? That happens all the time. These got collected, posted up on a Russian forum, and sold. Pretty common cybercrime. Just so happens that it was attached to DDoS. All right, so we have our malware built, scary exe.exe. Now we need to bypass that AV that we love making fun of. Not very difficult. You just hire someone to do it. So these guys, $20 per bot. They will do what they have a crypto service. They can encrypt it, custom packer, whatever. These guys know how to evade AV pretty easy. Just like any of us would go to one of the AV test sites, these guys do the exact same thing. They see what detected it, what didn't, and there's your service. Pretty simple. So now we have our malware. Now we have the ability to bypass AV. Now we need to build a botnet. We don't have to do that ourselves either. So here we have Mr. Worf in Russia that will help us out. He sells these 1,000 at a time. These are called loads, and a load is essentially a empty owned box, if you will, right? It's a box that he owns, but it doesn't have any malicious malware on it. It's kind of empty and an empty malware container, if you will, right? And so he will sell these to you 1,000 at a time. You can see here different pricing depending on the geography. Asia being the cheapest at $18, a mix for $25, and without $50. Now, the reason here is probably pretty obvious, right? If there are some companies that can afford to simply geo-block. If you're not doing business with, say, China or other countries, you can just geo-block, and so that might affect, the usefulness of the botnet. So, for instance, take into account spam. A lot of the spam came from Asia, came from the U.S. And of course, the whole point of spam getting better over many years was the move away from signatures and the move towards reputation. And so the spammers figured, all right, well, let's go to the one place everybody trusts. Let's go to Canada. And so much of your spam now comes from Canada. It's a more trusted IP space. And this pricing is a reflection of that. So now we know where we can buy our loaders to load our new malware. And you can see in this case, this is a DGAF bot shop selling bots for 3 cents each. So that's $30 per 1,000. You could actually go buy 1,000 bots from Wharf for 18 bucks, sell them for 30, make 12 bucks. Pretty easy turnaround, and you actually didn't have to do anything criminal at all. You just played the middleman. And then in the end, what really happens, of course, is the commoditization of cybercrime, and that's, of course, tying all these things together. So you need a cyber toolkit that will allow you to do anything, whether that's DDoS, banking fraud, key logging, custom packers, whatever the case might be. And that's what we've seen over the years, is these things just getting better and better, right? Just as every vendor that's present here builds and releases new software and it gets better over time, hopefully, these guys have been doing this now for quite some time, and of course it's gotten better and better over time. And that's also, of course, how they continue to make money, because the margins have gotten smaller over time as well. All right, so we've got cybercrime out of the way. Let's move on to hacktivism. And I won't spend a ton of time on this, mainly because you probably all are quite familiar with Anonymous. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I want to highlight a few things. One being, again, the motivation. Right? If you have not read a fantastic piece on attrition.org about Sun Tzu, it is hilarious. And this list is from that article. In the old days of the industry, right, we would always say, you'd hear somebody say, well, think like a hacker. And this, of course, is where the massive pen testing industry came from. And so, right, we would think like the hacker, beat up on our own network, and then you got compliance and reports, et cetera, and that's how we ended up to where we are. Of course, the point now is with Anonymous, with hacktivism, it's extremely difficult to know who is attacking you. And that's, again, why I stress the motivation, right? So it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's one of these people, a 24-year-old black hat intent on compromising any company, or a military contractor in Iraq. None of that really matters. It's the motivation, right? So what many enterprises have found themselves in is are we going to do anything that might upset Anonymous? Is our press release going to upset them? Our competitor is now getting DDoSed. Is that a possible problem for us? And so it's more about, why might they be coming after us, not necessarily who they are. Because it's extremely difficult to, of course, know who these people are at this point. The internet is a big place, and Anonymous is very, very geographically dispersed. All right, so just a couple incidents here. This one in 2008 was the big kind of coming out for Anonymous, if you will, the first high-profile attack. Of course, it was involving Tom Cruise and Scientology, so not many of us really worried so much about it. I think somebody should do a what InfoSec loves about Anonymous, because certainly this and the Westboro Baptist Church would probably be high on the list. But that was kind of the, wow, this is something different we haven't seen, right? Things really started to change in the late 2000s, and this was a big part of that. Now, they've used a lot of different tools over time. I'm sure many of you have seen this one, low orbit ion cannon. Very popular, has been around for quite some time. You can see some different options here, URL or an IP, what you want the text in the tool to say. Fairly easy. Early on, Anonymous had pretty decent skills, right? It was a smaller group, technical people that knew what they were doing. But as time progressed, they needed to get things to a point where anyone could be a part of the movement, and that's happened drastically over time. And that's kind of where this came from. This was, I think, I did a session up in New York with a bunch of CSOs and CISOs, and they all said this event, Operation Payback, was really the event that brought DDoS to light for them, right? That's what made them pay attention to DDoS. Made them question what they were doing as a company, and really kind of, I think, reinvented DDoS, if you will. This was because, of course, they could essentially build a opt-in botnet, right? Anybody could volunteer, right? If you were a housewife at home ironing clothes, you could still be a part of a DDoS attack, right? And that's definitely a change, something different we had not seen before. So how did they do this? Well, they took tools like Loic and they made them a whole lot easier. This is probably my favorite Loic variant. We just heard all about JavaScript. This is developed in JavaScript. Extremely easy to use. You can see you pretty much just plug in your target, whether you want to append anything to your message, and you go. And the fantastic thing about doing this in JavaScript, of course, is one, it runs in a web browser, so anybody can go to a URL, load it up, right? So that's nice and easy. You can already have these points in this tool populated, making it even easier. And you can, of course, even automate it. So you can have the JavaScript automatically run. You could even send this out as spam and recruit people to be a part of the DDoS attack that, of course, never wanted to be if they were, went and clicked on the link, right? So this really brought the DDoS tools kind of down to earth for the average person that could just go to a website rather than having to download a tool from the suspicious anonymous that they just got hooked up with, and made things quite easy. And this allowed them to really start getting a lot of folks involved. Now, what have we seen from Anonymous since Operation Payback? Obviously, that was about WikiLeaks, Julian Assange. Really, the last big thing we saw related to Julian Assange was last year, where he was in Europe and they were talking about extradition. And of course, Anonymous got upset about that and went after a bunch of UK websites. And there's people here that follow Anonymous much closer than me. I would say this is probably the last big full-on anonymous movement you had, where you had really a worldwide entity coming together to help. What you see now is a lot more fragmented type of operations. And that's the issue. That's really what's changed, I think, over the last year. Anything having to do with WikiLeaks and Assange, you can get a lot of anons involved in that kind of stuff. I want to give you another tool here because this one is a bit more feature-rich, if you will. You can see a lot of different types of settings here, port, use proxy, all sorts of things. You've got your IRC server here that you can go into botnet mode. You can point it to different things, and the best part of this is you have what they call Packet Blaster, which allows you to customize the packets that you're going to send, right? So if you want to screw with the headers or the payload in any kind of different way, this gave the technical folks down in Brazil the ability to really customize the DDoS to whatever their needs are. And you see this quite often. Depending on what geography you're in the world, the tools might be different. And you saw that quite a bit in some of the recent operations. This is what I would say Anonymous has been doing the last year. A lot of political-oriented stuff that is more local in nature. All right, so at this point, you had the Canadian election. The Mexico election was a big target that was successfully defended. Dominican Republic, Russia, Ukraine, South Korea. I would say at this point, if there's an election in the world, Anonymous is probably involved somehow, some way, generally using DDoS. It's certainly a very popular and easy way for them to get involved and try and if not shape change, at least get some kind of message across about what their agenda is. And so to that point, what have we seen lately? Op Israel, Op USA, very good examples of more regional type of activity. Things that sound very scary. There was a ton of buzz around Op USA, lots of articles written, and then of course it kind of came and went. The issue, of course, is that there's lots of Anonymous in America. So, lots of anons were like, this is ridiculous. Why would you go after this particular country, right? With Israel, Israel gets attacked every day. If you really want to talk about cyber warfare, that's a good country to start. I don't think they were sweating Anonymous given what they have to put up with day to day. But this is the kind of stuff you see now. So if you want to build a paste bin scraper and start looking for pound op, you can watch this all the time, and it's pretty regular, but most of this is going to be website defacement and generally credential information dumps. To get Anonymous to do a really large DDoS, you really have to upset a large group of them to do it at this point. I say that, and then something bad will happen. But if you're going, if you're looking at say the last year, most of their activity has been more regional or more op-oriented like this. All right, moving on to the next topic here is competitive takeout. And this is something that has not gotten a lot of coverage, really until just recently. But this is actually, again, one of the most common things that actually happens in the DDoS world. And it doesn't come out as often for some reason. The press doesn't cover it very much. And it just kind of comes and goes. It's also very popular in other regions as well. It happens a lot in Southeast Asia. But I'm going to give you a couple examples that are here, one at least from the States. So seeing these kinds of advertisements are pretty easy to do. I mean, you can literally just Google them. They'll pop right up. If you spend any time on hack forums or anything like that, these are all over the place. Dancho Danchev, actually of WebRoot, covers quite a bit of these. This is a great example from about a year ago using DirtJumper 5. Typical stuff here, right? He's going to advertise, send floods, get floods, post floods, et cetera, and then of course you get your pricing, pretty darn cheap, and obviously until recently accepting Liberty Reserve. There will be quite a few examples of that here, and this is very, very typical of what you see. In the old days, they would advertise the size of the botnet. Maybe some of the bandwidth related to the botnet, but it's really come down to service, right? So as these services have gotten more commoditized, it's more about supporting you as the customer, et cetera, right? How are they going to win your business over the zillion other DDoS services that exist? This slide is just here so you all can take a picture and put it on Twitter and say they finally got Holden's title right. Nobody laughed. Actually, this is a great example of what you often see. Test 10 minutes before booking and consultation with our specialists. Sounds all very professional. This is the kind of thing where they're really trying to set themselves apart. So it's about giving you a free test so that you are sure, because you're dealing with a criminal here. You want to make sure that the service works as advertised, and you of course want to make sure that you get the results you want and the support is there, et cetera, et cetera. So that is really where they try and differentiate and set their services apart. So an example of a competitive takeout. This is a really interesting one because this guy is actually a serious big-time businessman in Russia. He's got his own Wikipedia entry. It's pretty fascinating. Pavel Vrubrovsky. He is the CEO of ChronoPay. He's been a business guy in Russia since I think he was 18. And he had been suspected of being involved in sketchy activity. It's Russia. But he had never really done anything where the FSB was like, all right, we got to go after this guy. Until his company and one of his competitors went in on a bid, I think for an airline, to be the payment. So this is typical. This is similar to say Liberty Reserve or PayPal in Russia. And so they wanted to be the official payment for this company and went on a bid. And so the story goes, of course, that they launched a DDoS for quite some time, at least a week, if not 2 weeks, to the point where his competitor could no longer process payments. Obviously, when you're bidding on a big deal, this does not look good. And what's funny, of course, is that neither of them won it. Another competitor won it, and then the FSB came after Pavel here, and he went to jail for not very long. But it just goes to show, obviously, he thinks a lot of himself in this picture. But there are several examples out there where people have gotten busted. More often than not, you don't get busted. Why? Because these services are very anonymous. It's hard to get them traced back to you. Another example here of a DirtJumper 5 DDoS service. You can see here, again, not talking about size of botnet or bandwidth, but websites that they've attacked. Right? So if I can prove to you that I've taken down these sites, which are well-respected hack forums and other types of websites, right? Obviously, I can take down whoever you need to take down. You can also, of course, always tell many times what countries these are from, because here it says, "It is like hammer." Now this one's great because I don't pick on China too much in this presentation, but this is one of the few times I do. This is a bot in China, and this was actually used back in 2010 to attack an industrial food processor. And this, if you really want to look at some really interesting areas of the threat landscape that you don't generally see here in the States, Southeast Asia is absolutely fascinating. You've got lots of countries that have not liked each other for long periods of time, and some countries have amazing bandwidth down to the home, and they just don't care sometimes, right? So it's a pretty interesting place on the planet, and industrial food processor, not exactly what you would suspect would be a DDoS target, but it happened. Another great example here, this happened in the States. CEO of Usindit left, did another startup called Fly Upload, and then hired someone, of course, DDoS his old company. He did get busted, he did go to jail. I'm not sure that he's still there, but that obviously was not a wise business choice for him. Couple more here. This is another DDoS service, and again, you can tell some of the language is always great here. It says the best way of pesky competitors. That is generally the kind of attitude and talk you'll see in these advertisements. Most of it is geared towards competitive takeout. You'll see at the bottom all the light gray text. That's, of course, words, so the Google ranking is high, so his advertisement comes up before all the others. Like I said, very typical and similar to what any business would do. Now this is probably my favorite example. I don't think I'd ever seen a hacker commercial until early last year, and this one was advertising a DDoS service. This was Guapo's DDoS service, was launched March of last year. Started with the one on your left here, advertising his service. These are actresses. And gave information for how to contact him on Skype, and talked about taking out your competitor and the level of service. And then another one came out a couple weeks later, gave even more detail about how to contact him, more detail about the service, et cetera, et cetera. And the next thing you know, Guapo's got this really nice website, and you can actually see it on one of these, I think ddosservice.org. Very slick, professional looking, had yet another advertisement on there of a young man talking all about taking out your competitors with Guapo's DDoS service. Of course, he takes Liberty Reserve, and this was up for quite some time and pretty interesting to watch. Now, you'd think Guapo would be someplace else, but a lot of people actually think he was based out of New York. Wasn't up for very long. Guapo made some great commercials, and I think a lot of reporters talked to him on Skype. He did some interviews and then disappeared, probably because everybody was watching him. But recently, there's been some interest in this area, which I'm really glad to see. I think we all know Brian Krebs does some really good writing, and recently featured this one, again, another commercial with a professional actor talking about a DDoS service. I think Krebs just did this a week or two ago, and everybody was up in arms, amazed that they took PayPal. Of course, what else are they? They're not going to take your credit card. So another great example of something recent where you can easily purchase a DDoS service. You don't have to do any of the cybercrime, build your own botnet type of activity. All right, now on to the buzzwords. I want to talk just a little bit about a campaign-based DDoS, if you will, and then end that up with cyberwar. So I think this might be one of the biggest examples with Sony. Sony got hit, of course, with a very large DDoS. Some people even said it was lulzsec, who knows, but the issue here when you're getting DDoSed is that it's not an IT asset DDoS, and I think that's what a lot of people think of. Again, looking at it as a network issue, but it's very much a business asset DOS, right? So if you think about your website, www whatever, that website consists of the bandwidth coming down, the service from your ISP, all those obnoxious perimeter devices you have, then to the server, then to the application. And so those make up your website, not just the box over in the corner. And every single point along that way is a potential bottleneck for DDoS to occur. And so in Sony's case, the idea was, okay, we're being DDoSed. It's been said that they started pulling things out, which obviously lowered their ability to monitor and have some level of security. And obviously, it's a huge drain on your staff. There's many that call it a DDoS on a distraction, right? So it's happened for a long time in the finance space. They'll launch a DDoS, and then of course they'll steal credit card numbers, financial data, et cetera. So it's pretty tried and true and very typical. All right, picking on China again, because how can you not pick on China and talk about APT? This is a common kind of remote access Trojan. It just so happens that this one has DDoS ability. We are commonly seeing this more and more. It's just highlighting the fact that DDoS is now many times a feature of the threat landscape, and that includes campaign, intellectual property theft type of activity. Now, many times I think when we talk about APT, I think it's going to be the last time I say it. We like to think that these are very targeted, custom, really amazing types of malware. But that's not necessarily the case. Even this intellectual property theft is getting more mature. And this is a great example here of Extreme Rat. You can see here you can buy it for 100 euros. And this malware was built specifically for a campaign where you're wanting to steal information. Not simple, credentials or keylogging stuff, but really, intellectual theft, at a very advanced level, right? So you can buy this malware off the shelf, and then you can customize it for what your campaign needs to be. And commonly, that's what you see. Poison ivy actually is used quite often in very targeted campaign-based attacks. So it's not always the most sophisticated stuff. As we know, attack only has to be as sophisticated as it takes to get the job done. And many times that is a reflection of the motive of the attacker and what the target is. This one was used against U.S. and Israeli government institutions and also Syrian activists. All right, now for the fun. I know all these terms are obnoxious, and this cartoon's even getting obnoxious at this point, but like I said, I want to get us riled up before we end the day. So I want to talk a little bit about cyber warfare, mainly because we know a bit more about it than we did a couple years ago. There were actually some of the biggest names and experts in the industry were debating years ago that cyber warfare simply did not exist, which I think they have now had to recant. It does exist. It's existed for quite some time. Certainly, cyber espionage has existed for a very long time. If any of you have read Cliff Stoll's Cuckoo's Egg, that's a great example, late 80s. And we know that the government's been buying zero-day vulnerabilities now for probably close to a decade, at least that I know of. So what would they be doing with zero-day that would be defensive, would be my question. So I would say this is a very popular topic when discussing cyber war, but I know we don't necessarily love this term in the industry. So I would say it's upon us to change things. However, I would say you're ice skating uphill if you think you're going to get people to stop using the word cyber war or APT or cloud or big data. So give it up. But I would say we could DDoS the rest of the industry with some new terms. I was telling Jericho earlier, I was blown away that as an industry we actually got people to stop saying virus all the time, and now many people use malware. I thought we'd be saying virus forever, but malware is actually very typical now. So I would say it's, if you want to change things, stop reading the Geneva Convention and carrying on about what war means. Start reading somebody that matters, like George Carlin. A guy that has many books on analyzing not only the English language, but how we use the English language, all right? The problem is that cyber warfare is already coined. APT is already coined. So we can hate the terminology, but it's on us to either educate the person that is misusing it or give another term to be used, all right? So I don't care what you choose. It could be cyber conflict. You can correct them and say cyber espionage. You pick. But the point is it's on us as an industry to get marketing to stop using terms we don't like. And if you are buying from a vendor using a term you don't like, you should probably tell them that. We changed virus into malware. We can probably change other stuff, or at least we can add to it. DDoS your marketing people or your salespeople. Maybe we've got a shot, all right? But I don't think that the term should have us shy away from the discussion of something we do know that occurs. Attribution is difficult, but we know what happens, all right? So to that point, there are some talks that I'd like to reference here. Jericho and Josh Corman actually did a pretty good, 2 talks actually on this subject, where they went through the history, and it was very painful for them because that took a lot of work and research. Marcus Rainham has been doing some talks about this, just did one at OSCERT. And Dave Eitel just did a talk where he brought up these WikiLeaks articles at Syscan. And so I want to cite these and point out, I think, some important pieces. Funny enough, the WikiLeaks incident is actually how we learned quite a bit about cyber warfare. We knew the government was buying 0 days, but then we actually found out how much, what that relationship looked like, who the vendors were. We got all this information on how the US and Russia talk about this sort of thing. Russia's interesting because they're the exact opposite of America, right? When there's a problem to an American, we just go solve it, right? We're very responsive people. Security industry is a great way to look at that, right? Something happens, all right, then we respond and do something about it. And then we fail, we succeed, and then later on, in the twilight of our careers, we write a book. Russia, on the other hand, very theoretical people, right? So after the fall of communism, they had a lot of free time on their hand. They figured, hey, let's start looking at the cyber thing. They've been thinking about this a long time. They know espionage incredibly well at all levels. And so you can see a lot of that in WikiLeaks and how Russia's approached this. Anyway, what it says here is there's an arms race. The US see it, Russia sees it, and it is, cybersecurity is a political military issue. That is the way these governments view it. I would say that's the way most governments view it. Now the problem, of course, with cyber warfare is attribution. It's a problem with any attack, right? Attribution is incredibly difficult. And that was highlighted in this WikiLeaks here, where they say constraining state capabilities were meaningless when governments have no particular monopoly on attack tools, and attacks could be carried out by proxies. All right, so what makes cyber war so difficult? One, it can be mixed with other type of activity, hacktivism being a great example. And 2, it's all contracted. The government doesn't directly do anything. The government makes PowerPoint and builds budget. And then they go hire someone else to do it, right? Your Lockheed Martins, your Raytheons, Boeings, et cetera, et cetera. Every single country in the world does it just like the US. All of that kind of activity is outsourced. That actually leads into the next example here, going back to what was one of the first cyber warfare debated incidents was Estonia. So Estonia had a statue of a Russian soldier from World War II with the victory over the Germans, and Estonia wanted to move it, along with some burial plots that were close to it. Obviously, that upset Russia, and then next thing you know, there's tons of DDoS and web defacement activity. Obviously, the press jumped on that and said cyber warfare. Arbor actually did a really good job of tracking this, and we looked at where the attacks came from, and of course, they came from a botnet all over the world. Tons of it came from the US. So can you say for certain cyber warfare? No. However, Putin has, Eugene Kaspersky on speed dial. Why is it such a stretch for me to think that he's got other people on speed dial? So, it is a topic where sometimes you have to, take a leap of faith and say, is that possible? Yes. We also know, of course, that it's possible that it was not related to any government at all. It could also be that you've got, how many sketchy people do you have in a government? It doesn't necessarily have to come from the top, right? That sort of thing happens. Over a year later, we saw the same thing between Russia and Georgia. DDoS was a very, very big deal in the late 2000s in Eastern Europe in general, so some of the pioneers. Now, generally, matter of fact, if you see any of the talks, and actually I'll give you some background on this. I actually went on a bit of a rant on Twitter one day, and Jericho and my friends Tom Cross and Rob Graham disagreed so vehemently with me, they all went off and wrote blogs. Their blogs even disagreed with each other, which just goes to show how little anyone agrees on this topic. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I don't think that should allow us to shy away from discussing it. You just have to discuss it in a sane manner and not say cyber too many times. But you'll notice China always comes up, and it has nothing to do with China, all right? Reasons why Russia and China are not your problem, all right? This is a world economy. It's a very flat world. We make lots of money off of various countries. Those countries make money off of us, right? So Obama scrapped the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, meaning that Russia was no longer a bad country, bad with human rights, that sort of thing. And so now they are part of the World Trade Organization. US firms can trade freely. Now there's legal support, there's intellectual property support, right? All the things that America needs to have a very successful relationship, as we have with many countries, is now there with Russia. I think Russia's like 144 million people, right? That's a pretty good market for the states to start selling into. China, you can see China owns a big chunk of our debt, the largest of any foreign holder. And of course, China sells a ton to the US. All right, so when you hear comparisons to a Cold War, the only part of it that really makes it that analogy work is the fact that there are lines where people are willing to walk up to them and not cross them. That's the good part, and I'll talk more about that here in a moment. Now, who should we be worrying about? Iran would be a good one. Now, if you're familiar with the bank attacks that have been occurring since late September, this is probably the most public campaign in history. We certainly know campaigns go for very long periods of time, but this one's been public from day one and has seen quite a bit of success along the way. Many of the top banks in the US, their websites fallen down. This has stressed and potentially even tested the ISPs of the United States. That's the concern of the US government. And of course, the US government has come out and said, we think this is Iran. You have not seen anything from any vendor, Arbor, or otherwise that can lend any credibility to that. I have no idea. All I can say is that if this was hacktivism, it would definitely have to be funded hacktivism. That's probably not difficult. Lots of rich people in the world with ideas of how things should be. So the point here is that for something to go on for 6-7 months, it's probably got to be funded at some level. Who it is, I don't know. So I would say Iran, obviously, if it was and you made that leap, they don't have as much to lose, right? Their relationship with the US, not the best. Another great example of that, North and South Korea. Not to say again that this was definitely cyber warfare. Initially, they said it was China and then said, no, it wasn't China. Again, attribution is insanely difficult. The one thing I would say is attribution is very difficult for us as an industry, right? We work with IPs, domains, URLs. These countries have 3-letter agencies that do this, and they have people on the streets, and they have other ways to do attribution that we don't. It's also their job to do attribution. There's no profit or motivation for most of us to chase attribution. All right, so again, extremely difficult. However, there was a North Korean defector that said there was 3,000 cyber war experts in North Korea, and they were going to take on the world. They're testing nuclear bombs again. Probably not a stretch to think that they're building some type of cyber capability. What made this and these other examples cyber warfare? The fact that these were offensive, right? So you have to make a step past cyber espionage, and you have to destroy something. Not necessarily physical, hence the word cyber being first, right? So in this case, they were looking at data for 7 months and then destroyed it. Another example, not necessarily against cyber warfare, but just kind of shows you the kind of activity that happens in Southeast Asia, the dispute over the Spratly Islands. Again, a lot of government websites DDoSed or defaced. And now to talk about the US, because the US is actually the easiest country to talk about in terms of cyber warfare. When I was a kid, Weapon X was Wolverine. And he was awesome, and he was one guy, and he could take out anything. Now anything called X is cyber. So you have Project X, which is the Pentagon wanting to make the US a serious cyber force. So the US looks at things as sea, air, land, and cyber. So they want to build up that fourth pillar, and Project X is their way of doing that. Plan X, which just came out in the press, I think this week or last, is probably an extension of that. Essentially, they want to make cyber warfare as easy as Angry Birds, so went the title. I think this is a very good analogy for the difference between Generation X and Gen Y millennials. We had Wolverine, you guys have Angry Birds. the point is, you go to the Spy Museum up in DC, you see tons of amazing, cool Cold War stuff, little cameras, all these things about taking pictures. Right now, the US government just contracts that out to one of the zillion defense contractors. They make a custom image for your iPhone, and all that stuff is right there. So if they're making custom images for spying, why would they not go ahead and load their weaponized exploits, which we know they're buying, onto your phone so you can use them wherever you're at? Makes a lot of sense, actually. The Angry Birds thing is ridiculous, but the rest of it makes sense. Closing up here, again, I would say the good part of this is that the reason why cyber warfare isn't this terrible thing where you hear all sorts of awful analogies about real war and real people dying is that nobody's really been willing to do what is possible, right? The worst we've seen was Stuxnet, which did affect the physical world. But you know, I can guarantee you a few of us have read the Geneva Convention. The US government and all the other governments have certainly read it. I'm sure they had an army of lawyers when they were developing Stuxnet and knew what they were getting themselves into. So the point here is that they're building up the capability. Have they really used it to date? Probably not to the point of what they have. Is it possible? Again, I think it's naive to think it's not. All right, so if we leave it up to the politicians and the press to discuss this topic, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. So I would ask all of you to, of course, if you're going to use the terminology, attempt to use it properly and educate and discuss it. How many of you follow politics? Show of hands. All right, well, you're halfway to following cyber warfare. Just takes a lot more reading. Again, start with some of the presentations. There's actually some material out there about this. And again, the espionage is the majority of it, but there are offensive aspects of it past that. And starting with some of these examples, the zillion companies out there that sell zero-day these days, you can start to draw some conclusions of your own. And I think the rest of the industry would like to hear those, so please do so. I will leave you with a thank you and some resources. We do have a great blog that actually features a lot of the tools that I covered here today. So I'll open it up to any questions, inflammatory comments from the peanut gallery, or corrections. Yes, here in the back. It does. It already does. The viability of what? Right. Right. Well, and it's pretty difficult as it is now, right? If you go back to Cliff Stoll's book, right, he had to follow that all the way back, and that was back in the good old days where you had IPv4 and things were much easier. IPv6 has already changed things. You know, the US still has a pretty good IPv4 space, but most countries, especially in Europe and definitely Asia, don't. There are countries that are now essentially, you know, natted internally. All right, so it's getting incredibly difficult, and that's why I said chasing attribution is really tough, and you know, that's why the government's honestly better left to do it, mainly because they have other resources. But it's going to become more of a challenge, certainly. You know, the other thing someone pointed out is it is unfortunate. You know, the internet is you know, it's the people's network. You know, it was born out of Cold War fears. But now it's used as the global communication method and commerce method. And it kind of stinks for the rest of us that nation states are going to use that for, you know, espionage and other activity. But yeah, I see IPv6 only making it more difficult. I see, you know, the matter of fact, you know, the moment China goes to IPv6, things are going to fundamentally change on the internet. So it won't just be attribution, it will be a lot of things. Other questions? No inflammatory comments. Wow. All right. Jake, you want to close us out? Thank you very much.